September used to be a time to get super psyched for fall brawl, but it was also a time to get super depressed because school was starting up again. However, now that I'm older, maybe Rodney Dangerfield was onto something when he decided to go back to school. Which got me thinking, how would one go about finding the right wrestling school? After all, there are plenty of places to teach you wrestling, so how would you choose the best one? Which is why I've decided that I'm going to take a look at 3 of pro wrestling's most famous learning trees and examine them through one of higher education's most in-depth assessment processes. Because today, Dave looks at wrestling schools through the Princeton Review. I just want to say that this was not an entirely easy episode to do for several reasons. First off, the Princeton Review, for those who don't know, ranks colleges based off of criteria as surveyed by students. Now admittedly, I was not a student at any of these locations and therefore have limited information. Also, the criteria is meant for academic colleges, not wrestler boot camps. So take this for what it's worth, a modified version of the Princeton Review from the perspective of a fan from a distance and for entertainment value rather than an accurate dissection of these 3 schools. And speaking of which, while there are many places that will teach you wrestling, I had to narrow it down to a manageable amount. So I chose 3 of the most famous wrestling learning locations of all time: WCW's Power Plant, the WWE Performance Center, and the Hart Family Dungeon. These 3 will be put through the ringer as the Princeton Review has many categories to scrutinize these schools by. Now this doesn't translate to a perfect fit, but I managed as best as I could. So without further ado, let's get the review underway. Campus quality. Now the Hart family house being an actual house does have certain advantages in terms of having a family feel to it, but while it is a mansion, it can't quite compete in other areas of being a pristine college campus. Now the power plant was a warehouse turned into a wrestling gym, so it's not looking too great either. The Performance Center, on the other hand, is a state-of-the-art wrestling facility. So because it's the newest building and the only one still currently in operation, it does have an unfair advantage in many ways, but nonetheless, it does offer quite a lot. In addition to having more actual rings than any of its competitors, it also has a specialty ring built just for budding high flyers to practice moves while taking the high risk out of high risk maneuvers. They also have cameras to record all of the trainees' work in real time, and it also has iPad stations for wrestlers to review all of their work. It also has its own 5,500 square foot gym in addition to the rest of the facility. And the icing on the cake, there is also some great memorabilia there too, like the ring bell from the very first WrestleMania. So the Performance Center wins this round. Demographics. In terms of ethnic diversity, they're all fairly even for the most part. However, there is still a bit of a problem when it comes to having a variety of people. Well, the dungeon has Natty, and both the Performance Center and the Power Plant had 2 female trainers on staff. The Performance Center gets the point because they, by far, have the best amount of gender diversity when it comes to students, especially with the events leading to and following the WWE's Women's Revolution. Town life. Now, the dungeon is located in an upscale residential neighborhood. As nice as that might be for campus life, it doesn't quite stand up to the available options of major cities like Atlanta and Orlando. And I don't want to get into the whole Georgia-Florida feud thing, but out of the 2, I am going to have to pick Orlando as the winner here. After all, the theme parks are a fairly unique experience that Orlando has to offer wrestlers that none of the other schools can. So this one, yet again, goes to the Performance Center. Safety and security. Now this is where the first major strike against the WWE's training camp occurs. August 31st, 2015, a man was shot by police outside of the Performance Center. As the story goes, he was obsessed with AJ Lee and made several attempts to get into the facility despite the WWE having an injunction against him. Now, it is important to note that he did survive the shooting and was not actually able to get in the building itself. But nevertheless, this kind of thing never happened at the other 2 locations, so the Performance Center is out of the running. Moving on, while it does make for an amazing wrestling experience, Stu Hart could bring a grown man to tears, and he even wrestled a tiger. So with that being said, Stu Hart scares the living crap out of me, and therefore, the point is awarded to the Power Plant just out of general principle. Extracurriculars. Now it does seem that all 3 schools have weight training and other physical exercise programs beyond just pro wrestling. The Hart Dungeon, in fact, also had regiments of other forms of wrestling too, like catch wrestling. And it also taught forms of martial arts fighting as well. But one school reigned supreme in terms of extracurriculars, and that's the WWE Performance Center. The PC has special mirror rooms and green screen rooms to help develop personalities as well. In addition, the former trainer of mic work and persona skills was none other than the legend Dusty Rhodes. So in terms of extracurricular, the Performance Center has the win. Party school. Believe it or not, this is part of the process in the Princeton Review. It does separate types of schools, knowing that some offer more of a party experience than others. But there is a section dedicated to just how much partying your school does for those who are interested in that kind of atmosphere. Now, the exact details of how hard these three schools party down isn't exactly clear, but with the WWE's wellness policy for the main roster competitors, it might be fair to say that, well, the Performance Center could very well be the prudest of these three schools. Also, the Heart Dungeon being located in a nice suburban home might not be the best place to get crunk on a regular basis, which is why the Atlanta warehouse, based off of pure speculation, seems to be the best place to get buck wild. So, if that's the kind of thing you're into, another point goes to the power plant. Enrollment. This has to do with what it takes to actually be accepted into the program. Off the bat, the Performance Center and the Dungeon seemingly have no restrictions to try out. The power plant allegedly had a size requirement for male competitors, 5 foot 9 inches tall and 180 pounds, so it's out of the running. But while the Performance Center has no official physical requirements that I could find, it still does have a high standard for acceptance. Usually, wrestlers are scouted before training, and while they do have tryouts, the Performance Center isn't known for being a place to teach wrestlers completely from scratch. Apparently, they prefer that wrestlers have a strong background before they even get accepted into the program. Plus, the power plant was said to have a costly tuition just to train there. So the point for the most accepting school goes to the Dungeon. And now, in terms of actual course curriculum, that would naturally have to apply to wrestling. And when it comes to the shoot-style wrestling of the Heart Dungeon, it seems clear that by leaps and bounds, the Heart Dungeon is above the rest. Stu Hart was known to teach first-hand lessons on holds that really hurt and how to really administer painful maneuvers in order to teach wrestlers how to really wrestle, so that way they could make their fake wrestling look just more realistic. And when we look at graduates, the Performance Center doesn't have as many established talents yet because it's fairly new, so the merits as far as teaching goes aren't as noticeable. And while the power plant has created the natural born thrillers, who I think are great, it also produced Goldberg, which just goes to show you how uneven the training was there. As for the Dungeon, Lance Storm, Chris Benoit, and the entire Hart family and more, it seems clear that as far as wrestling goes, the Dungeon by far yields the best results. So, 1 point for Calgary. Job placement. Job placement is a factor too, and while all of these schools do have their fair share of stars that came out of them, the Performance Center, once again, is still relatively new. Also, the power plant mostly reads like a where are they now list, while the Dungeon is more of a who's who. And while the power plant and the PC were created specifically by wrestling companies as a farm system, it doesn't mean that attendees are guaranteed anything, and well, they're not. The Heart Dungeon, on the other hand, during its heyday, actually had WWF employed wrestlers sent to them in order to get some seasoning. So in terms of job placement, the Dungeon trained many already main rostered wrestlers and therefore gets the advantage and takes this one down. Now, while Stu Hart is the OG Grand Master of the Dungeon's wrestling training, he was but only one man. Professor accessibility and student approval of professors is also a criteria. Now, some of Stu's sons have taught as well, and there have also been other guest teachers, but many of these names are not known quite as well outside of the Dungeon. Moving on to the power plant staff, it may not have had an all-star list of teachers, but it did have some notable names that are much more recognizable than Bruce Keith or even Ross Hart. Some power plant teachers included Paul Orndorff, Bobby Eaton, and Sergeant Buddy Lee Parker. The Performance Center, on the other hand, has had some great guest trainers like Scott Hall and Mike Quackenbush. Their head trainer is currently Albert and was formerly Hugh Morris. And that does bring me up to another issue. While the Dungeon was harsh, they never had the issues that led to Morris's release from the company or the other harassment claims that plagued the Performance Center. In addition, Buddy Lee Parker also had a reputation for being of a similar vein. So for having the nicest staff and for the excellence of Stu Hart, the faculty point goes to the Dungeon. Healthcare services. The Dungeon, being Canadian, does have that whole free healthcare thing going. However, the Performance Center, in addition to a state-of-the-art physical therapy room to treat injury, has a cutting-edge prehab facility that is designed to actually help prevent injuries before they ever happen. So in terms of health, the winner is the Performance Center. Studying abroad. The Dungeon gets the unfair advantage this time, since it's located in Canada and a lot of their business was with the WWF, which is based in America. It's not all that surprising that international traveling points go to the Dungeon. Although as the WWE expands its market around the globe, this may very well change in the future for the Performance Center. But for now, I think it's safe to say the Heart Dungeon wins. So things are all tied up between the legendary Hart Family Dungeon and the WWE Performance Center at 5 apiece, and there is but 1 point left. It has to do with just how much do students love their school. Now, yet again, I did not go to any of these schools. So first, the power plant, which I did not forget about, is definitely not stealing this last point away. According to one source, they had an 85% dropout rate, with some claiming that they had valid complaints that were never even addressed. So the power plant is definitely out. But the dungeon and the performance center are not blemish-free here either. It seems that both schools have had their fair share of disappointed ex-students. So this is not an easy point to give out, especially since it's probably the most subjective point of all. And having not been to either makes forming an opinion so much more difficult. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that if I were able to attend either, where would I choose to go? And I really do like the modern approach of a pro wrestling-like college experience that the Performance Center has to offer. However, I will always be a Hart family man in the end. The prestige of graduating from the Hart Family Dungeon by far means the most to me out of all of these schools, and their grads are the kind of wrestlers that I would want to wrestle like. So the winner is the Hart Dungeon. Well, there you go. What's your favorite wrestling school and why do you want to go there? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to give me a big thumbs up and to share this video. Thanks so much for watching, and this has been Dave Knows.